nemoguća je misija.
It's rather mission impossible to summarize in 20 minutes more than 2 decades of experience in an extremely important but at the same time very painful process, which in a way is a consequence or a part of the genocide committed on the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Of course, I'm talking about the process of search for those whose destiny is rather uncertain, even though we are all very much certain that they are no longer alive. We're talking about search for missing persons in the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I will just give you some shots of the consequences of what had happened during the aggression against Bosnia and Herzegovina. About 200,000 people killed, of which 32,000 are now considered missing. And actually this was the statistics at the moment when we have signed the Dayton Peace Agreement. This is a culture-side, herbicide. You see the burning of buildings that were set on fire, so over 1,600 of religious establishments destroyed, mainly mosques, but also dozens of Catholic churches, etc. At least, or the minimum, 150,000 war prisoners who have been through the death camps or other private or public prisons. On this slide, you can see some of the death camps within Bosnia and Herzegovina, and each of these death camps, or in each of these death camps, you will find at least one mass graves with several hundreds of several hundreds of bodies. And the main or the biggest ones can be found actually in Bosanska Krajina, Ključ, the lower Drina River stream, or that area of eastern Bosnia, including Srebrenica. Today, in the introductory remarks of Ms. Šuško, we have heard that there are more than 150 mass graves, but today this number exceeds 750. In which we have found the remains of at least of 3 or more victims. In the previous line, you could see actually the distribution of these mass graves. And here you have some of the statistics about the number of reported missing persons, but this is not the final figure, because we all know that within the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina there were some parts where all members of the immediate or broader family have been executed, and there was no one to report that they were missing. So of course, even now, 23 years after the beginning of the war, we still have some far relatives or even people who are not related to them asking about destinies of some of their neighbors who are missing. 32,152 reported missing persons, and over the past 20 years, namely since 1996 until present, we have exhumed, namely we have found and then identified about 3/4 of those missing persons reported, namely we're talking about 75%. Unfortunately, all these exhumed victims, and we're talking about some 24,000, they have not been actually named because we haven't managed to identify them by application of the classical method or the DNA analysis. So we still have about 9% of the remains unidentified. So we're talking about some less than 2,000 such victims. So, of course, those who have been identified have been handed over to their families. On this slide, you see the statistics about the regions and an overview of the regions in which the most massive disappearances happen, you know. So you'll see that in the territory or area of Srebrenica and Žepa, unfortunately, both of these were considered the protected enclaves. Unfortunately, even though at that time the world was fully aware of what was going on in Srebrenica, we're talking about 1995, we see that the number of reported missing persons within the territory of Srebrenica and Žepa, according to the International Missing Persons Commission, and again I need to highlight that this is again only the number that corresponds to the number of those who have reported the missing persons and who gave their blood samples, you know, for testing. So practically this really refers only to those who have been reported. So we see that Srebrenica area was the most heavily affected. The second territory where we also have the mass graves, or the major mass graves, is actually the area of Krajina, where we have about 7,000 reported missing persons. Then the river of Drina, the upper and the lower stream of the Drina river, where we have about 8,000 reported missing persons. And after that, we also have some smaller areas, such as Middle Bosnia. I mean, they're smaller in terms of the number of reported missing persons, or Canton Sarajevo, where we have only about 2,300 missing persons reported, or in Posavina, about 1,400, etc. Here we have an overview of the missing persons according to, or by their gender. So we see that every missing person reported, or every 9th missing person reported, is a female. So this also speaks about the nature of all these atrocities that happened here in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So it's very clear from this slide, but it's going to be even clearer from the slides that will come, that this was the war against civilians. Every 25th missing person reported was a child. So we're talking about a person under the age of 18. So of course there were many victims that were younger than 10, including the youngest victim, virtually the newborns, and they have been actually reported only by the name or surname of their parents, because we're talking about children that were only few hours old. For example, in Visegrad and Pionirska Street, where over 70 children and women were burnt in a house, including a baby which was at that time only 48 hours old. If we look the structure by nationality, then we see that the majority of them are Bosniaks. Then we also have Bosnian Serbs, 11.5%, Bosnian Croats 4%, 0.3% of Albanians, and 0.2% are others. So we're talking about maybe 20 different nationalities, including people who come from the west or east, even people who came from across the ocean. And of course, in these others, we have included all other, minorities that were present actually within the former Yugoslavia. So this was the war against civilians, and this is best corroborated by this slide, because you see that only 13% were actually soldiers missing in action, while 87% of all missing persons were civilians. Here we have an overview which tells us about the most appropriate relatives who could provide the DNA samples for identification. So we use the mitochondrial DNA analysis, taking the blood samples from the mother's side and their relatives. Of course, in the first line, you know, the most valid samples are actually from the immediate relatives, namely parents or the siblings. So where were the mass graves in Bosnia and Herzegovina? On the surface, on the places such as natural pits, some of which were actually over 100 meters deep, the caves and canyons, lakes and water reservoirs, the wastes, landfills, or even septic tanks, the whales, hardly accessible areas in the forests, etc. For example, this is one of the very drastic examples of a natural pit in which we have found 16 victims. So this gentleman here on the left was a witness who showed us or told us about this pit. So he survived the but actually none of his relatives or family survived. And this pit, which is about 80 meters deep, and it is located near Konjic. So this is where we have found the remains of his spouse and 16 other victims. But actually, few years after that, in the place of execution nearby Boračko jezero, we found another mass grave where we have found the spouse of this gentleman here. This is an example of a surface mass grave, so a group of Bosniaks, 16 of them, of which 15 were women and only one man, the youngest of which was actually women of 65 and the oldest was 102 years old. They were all executed in the village Kljuna, nearby Nevesine. So all villagers escaped the village, but a group of the senior citizens, where I said that the youngest was 65, they didn't manage to actually cross the mountain Crvanj, and they, you know, somehow found refuge nearby the village. So over the night, the members of the Serb army came in and they killed them all. The forensic team has identified or established that they were actually, that their throats were slit and their bodies were left there for years. You know, they were not even covered with earth. So when the prosecutors came from Mostar, for 6 years, the bodies were left on the surface. So these are the images of the village Kljuna nearby Nevesine. Here we have one of the regions which includes Srebrenica, and this is the region where we have found the majority of the missing person. It includes the upper and the lower Podrinje area. So it's really downstream the river, the Drina River. So this was one of the biggest mass graves. At this point, it is not the largest, but indeed, I'm pretty sure that it is one of the largest in terms of the number of the victims that are to be found there. So a few years ago, we all witnessed, and some of us actually were even participants. Mr. Nice has mentioned it, that there were some volunteers or enthusiasts, you know, which decreases, you know, over the time. But in this case, we had another type of volunteers who helped us actually in this process. Over 2,000 BIH nationals helped us actually in sanation or rehabilitation of the riverbank of Peručac. So we're talking about an artificial lake which does have quite a lengthy bank. And we just needed to search this area within 20 days while they were doing the reconstruction or the repair of the hydroelectric plant. With the support of the Hague prosecutor's office, we asked even to prolong the process of repair in order to extend the time that we can explore the area. So we had some 3 months actually to search the left and the right bank. So with the assistance of over 2,000 volunteers, we searched both banks. We have brought over 1,000 of bags with the remains, but of course we have found about 300 victims on the both left and right bank of the Lake Peročac, and that included 3 municipalities in Bosnia. The surface that we have searched was 2.2 square kilometers. So one part actually of the lake sides with the border of the Republic of Serbia. Reduction of the level of the lake was up to the 18 meters. So you see the length or the height difference. So this is probably the best visible here on this slide. You see this tourist house. This is how it looks like when the lake is to its full capacity, to the full level, but you see that we have managed to lower the level of the water. So as I said, by 18 meters. Already on 358 micro locations we have found the body remains of the victims. So some of these locations are mentioned here on the slide. So what's interesting here, that in the first month of the search we have found very few skeletons or the remains of the victims. Why? Because over the past 20 years, after they were executed in 1992 and partly 95, there was a lot of sludge which fully covered the remains of the bodies, and the water which actually sedimented that, covered that, you know, so we couldn't find it. But luckily we were working from the July to October, and because it was very hot that summer, that sludge has dried and it's cracked. So virtually we could see that out of these cracks, out of this dried sludge, we could see the bones sticking out of it, even though we passed several times through that part and we haven't seen a bit. But all of a sudden some pieces of clothing or shoes were resurfacing, as if the earth felt that it needs to release or to get rid of the stuff that it had hit. So in this territory we found 6 soldiers which were killed sometimes between 1914 and 1916. These were the Austro-Hungarian officers, and we identified that due to the metal insignia that they wore, that they carried on their bodies. So subsequently in the 70s, probably they were buried somewhere nearby the banks of the Drina River. So after this artificial lake was created, the water fully covered the territory, and that's how these bodies ended up in this site. Another interesting territory or area is Bosanska Krajina, where we had about 3,173 mass graves. So even some of these were major in terms of the number of victims found. Indeed, Tomashica is one of them, and that it was a primary mass grave. We knew actually of this mass grave when that happened, you know, but it was very difficult to detect where the site was, because in particular this site was very mobile because it was used for different purposes, and that really prevented us from finding the typical signs and detecting the Tomashica site. Prior to discovering Tomashica, we had found a secondary mass grave which was actually nearby one of the pits. So first of all we detected where the bodies were moved And 10 years later, we found a primary site, primary mass graves, which was mentioned in the diary of General Mladic, where he said that about 1,000 of victims were found, and where the soldiers were asked to help with moving these bodies to the secondary mass grave. Both Bosnia and Kosovo became very much known by this phenomenon, which is probably not present elsewhere, or it has been rarely found elsewhere. So we're talking about this phenomenon of the secondary mass graves. So we even had a case of the tertiary mass grave, where the bodies were 2 times moved from the primary location. So unfortunately, there are many such cases. Now you see some of the pictures from Tomashica. And another case that made us very unique in the world, we're talking about the victims of genocide in Srebrenica. This is a path which is often called the Valley of Death, or the Path of Death, which leads towards Zvornička Kamenica. On the distance of 702 kilometers, we have found 11 secondary mass graves with different names, some of which were marked as Kamenica, the others as Čančari. But we're talking about one hole. So you go from the path, so practically on zigzag left and right side from the road, there are 11 mass graves found. Thanks to the satellite images which the government of Bosnia received from the ICTY through the assistance of the United States, you will see this is a primary mass grave, Glogova 1. So this is a huge complex of the graves, which were called Glogov 1 to 9. And that's where we have found 280 victims. And this mass grave was actually made immediately after the execution of victims in Kravica. And after that, the bodies were transferred with the bulldozers, of course, cut in pieces and taken in different directions. So this is one of the victims. This was a young man who was 22 at the time. And we see his lower jaw, which was found in mass grave Zeleni Jadar in Srebrenica. So this was a secondary mass grave. His right arm bone was found in Zeleni Jadar 4. The right hand bone was found in Zeleni Jadar 1. His right leg was found in a primary mass grave, and the left bone was found in Zalazia. So this person was scattered around within the distance of 32 kilometers in 5 different locations. As you could see from this image, he is still partly collected. We're still missing many parts of his skeleton. And probably that this person will be found in I don't know how many mass graves. So this is something that is, as far as I know, unique way of disturbing not only death but the survivors as well. Survivors from Srebrenica are deprived of the fundamental human rights, and that is to say goodbye to our beloved ones in a civilized and dignified way. So once they say goodbye to their families, they're not certain that maybe 2 months or 2 years after that we will knock on their door to tell them that a person that has been buried in Potočari has been found, or part of it has been found somewhere in another mass grave. And again, they will need to go through the same process again and again. Thank you very much.